If you're still awake, no problem. The city is already asleep for you. The lights went out earlier that night. Not all at once, not abruptly, but as if someone had been slowly switching off the day, little by little, carefully. First the shop windows, then the more distant windows. Finally, the streetlights that usually stayed on too late. It was an old city, accustomed to predictable schedules. There, the nights always arrived at the same rhythm, obedient to the routines of those who had lived there for decades. Therefore, no one found it strange at first. They only sensed that something had changed. Silence followed, not a heavy silence, but that comfortable silence that appears when everything is in order. No cars passing by, no conversations crossing the street, just the distant sound of time itself, slowing down. Perhaps you know this kind of place. Cities that seem to remember those who passed through them. Streets that hold ancient footsteps. Houses that breathe slowly when night falls. There, the darkness didn't frighten. It simply enveloped everything with more gentleness. The sky was clear, but without excessive brightness. The stars seemed further away, as if respecting that moment. The moon, discreet, observed from afar, without interfering. It was a night that didn't demand attention, just presence. The streets, now dimly lit, seemed wider, as if the space had expanded in the absence of light. The old facades took on soft contours, no harsh shadows, no abrupt contrasts. Everything seemed to be at rest, and, curiously, nobody seemed to miss the lights. There was a light feeling in the air, not of worry, but of pause, as if the whole city had silently agreed to end the day early. No announcement, no explanation, just because. Some windows remained dark, even where there was normally movement. Others showed only a weak, almost symbolic light, enough to say, "We are here, but we don't need to be seen." It was a night made for remembering, not anything specific, but that old feeling of when the world shrank in size at nightfall, when everything that mattered fit within the silence. And so, as time passed without haste, the city remained quiet. The lights, now extinguished, didn't seem to have failed. They seemed only to have understood that they weren't needed at that moment. Perhaps that night was not meant to be observed. Perhaps she had come only to be felt. At first, no one noticed exactly when normality began to slip away. There was no announcement, no different sounds, no abrupt interruptions. The city remained there, intact, as it always had been. Yet something was beginning to shift silently, like an old cog turning out of sync. The first sign was almost insignificant. A street lamp on a quiet corner stayed off longer than usual, nothing alarming. Those lampposts were old and failed occasionally, but that night, others began to do the same. One after another, not simultaneously, just earlier. Those who were still awake noticed, but didn't comment. Each kept the observation to themselves, as if it were too personal a detail to share. Perhaps it was just energy saving, perhaps maintenance, perhaps a decision made in some distant office, not important enough to warrant explanation. The curious thing is that there was no total darkness. The city was not left in the dark. There was always a light remaining, weak, scattered, enough to guide the steps, as if someone had calculated exactly how much light was needed so as not to cause discomfort, neither more nor less. On a street near the central square, a faded shop window reflected only the outline of the surrounding buildings. Where there had once been brightness and movement, now there were only soft, still shapes. Nothing seemed wrong, just different. The church tower clock struck the correct time, without delay. The sound echoed softly, as always. No sign of malfunction there. Time continued to run its course. It was the light that seemed to have chosen a different rhythm. Some residents, accustomed to walking at night, noticed that their footsteps sounded louder, not because the environment was quieter than usual, but because there were fewer distractions. Without bright lights, the senses seemed to adjust, focusing on what had always been there, but was rarely noticed. The wind drifted lightly through the narrow streets, stirring forgotten papers and dry leaves. A simple, ordinary movement, yet there was something about it that seemed more present, as if the city were breathing differently. At one point, someone tried to turn on a light that was normally left on late. Nothing happened. There was no click, no smell, just the absence of the expected result. The hand moved away from the switch, and the gesture was not repeated, not out of fear, but out of respect, as if, instinctively, it were better not to insist. The houses remained quiet. No loud conversations, no televisions blaring at excessive volume. It was as if everyone had agreed to speak more quietly that night, even without knowing why. The moon rose a little higher in the sky, offering a discreet light, enough to reveal the layout of the streets and the outline of the trees. It didn't replace the artificial lights. It didn't need to. It merely occupied the space left by them. And then came the most difficult feeling to explain. The city seemed smaller, not physically. The distances were the same. The streets remained where they always had been, but there was a different kind of closeness between things, as if everything were a little closer, a little more intimate. The lights hadn't completely failed. They simply weren't available in the usual way anymore, as if someone had decided that this night didn't need to be illuminated like the others. And yet, no one felt any urgency to solve it. No phones rang, no sirens blared through the air. No explanations were demanded. The mystery presented itself in the gentlest possible way, not by what was happening, but by what wasn't happening. Somewhere in the city, a solitary light remained lit longer than the others. A window, a high floor, hard to tell. It didn't draw attention. It simply existed, like a silent point of reference, saying that not everything had been completely extinguished. And perhaps that's what made it all the more curious. It wasn't completely dark. The light hadn't gone out. It just seemed distributed differently. The city never slept. She was waiting, and without realizing it, everyone started doing the same. As the hours passed, it became clear that no one was exactly asleep. The houses remained silent, but not in the kind of profound silence that accompanies sleep. It was an attentive, almost delicate silence, as if each inhabitant were lying down, listening to their own breathing and, at the same time, listening to the city. Some got up slowly, without turning on any lights, not out of economy, nor out of fear, but because the darkness no longer seemed like an obstacle. The furniture was familiar, the hallways familiar. Each house held enough memories to be traversed without haste. In an old kitchen, someone put water on to boil, watching the steam rise slowly, almost invisibly. The sound was low, comforting, a sound that had always been there, but that night seemed closer, as if nothing else was competing for attention. The windows began to become important points. There were no curtains being abruptly opened, only cracks, small openings, enough to look without being seen, not out of fear of others, but out of an almost childlike desire to observe without interfering. The street seemed different seen from inside. Without the usual lights, the shadows didn't accumulate. They stretched gently, blending into one another, creating shapes that weren't frightening. Trees projected slow patterns on the ground. Park benches seemed older, more respectable, as if they had regained the age they always had. Some residents remembered other nights, childhood nights, when the electricity failed and adults lit candles without haste, when time seemed slower, and no one spoke of fixing anything immediately. The memory didn't come as nostalgia, but as recognition. That feeling had been known before. An older man walked to his front door and opened it just enough to feel the night air. The smell was the same as always, but there was something about it that brought tranquility. Perhaps it was the coolness. Perhaps it was the absence of stimuli. He stood there for a few minutes, without thinking about anything specific. On another street, a woman sat in a chair near the window, holding an old photograph. It wasn't an important photo, no special date, just an ordinary snapshot from a time when the city had fewer lights, less hurry, less noise. She didn't try to understand why she had taken that photo. She just held it. The city was beginning to reveal forgotten details. The creak of a gate in the wind, the distant ticking of a wall clock, the single bark of a dog that soon fell silent, as if it too were attentive. Nothing happened urgently. The hours passed without making their presence felt. Time had ceased to be a commitment and had become merely a backdrop. Some people realized that their thoughts were different, no longer racing, no longer repetitive. Worries hadn't disappeared, but they were organized, like objects stored in a drawer. They still existed, but they didn't need to be touched at that moment. The absence of light seemed to have created space. Space to remember, space to feel, space to do absolutely nothing. In the central square, the fountain was off, as it always was at night. Still, someone passed by and stopped for a few moments, looking at the empty structure. No reflections, no glare, just stone and silence. And that was enough. The city offered no answers, but it also asked no questions. It was as if it were allowing each person to find their own rhythm again, even if only for a few hours. At some point, someone thought about calling the power company. The thought arose and then faded. It didn't seem necessary. Nothing was broken, nothing was wrong, just different. And, curiously, comfortable. The lights being off didn't create insecurity. They created closeness. With the streets, with the houses, with the past, with the tired body itself, now resting without being pressured by the constant glare. The city was being watched, yes. But, perhaps for the first time in a long time, it was also watching back. Without judgment, without haste, without clear intention. The night progressed, and no one could say if it would last minutes or hours. But everyone seemed to agree, silently, that there was no reason to interrupt. It was just a city. On a night darker than usual, breathing in its own time, at some point, without anyone realizing exactly when, the city stopped waiting for explanations. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just happened. Like when the body finds a comfortable position in bed and stops moving. The hours continued to pass, but they were no longer being counted. Clocks still marked the time, it's true. Some could be heard in quiet houses, others remained visible in dimly lit kitchens. Still, no one seemed interested in confirming whether the night was early or late. The need to know had dissolved. Outside, the moon continued its slow journey, as it always had, indifferent to human changes. Its light now seemed sufficient, not strong, not weak, just adequate, as if it had been there for centuries waiting for a night like this. Some windows began to close, not hastily, but carefully. It wasn't a gesture of isolation, it was a gesture of retreat. The houses welcomed their inhabitants back, preserving that experience as something that didn't need to be shared aloud. In an old room, someone lay down on the sofa without turning on the television. The remote control remained untouched on the table. There was no rejection of routine, just the feeling that night, it wasn't necessary. Thoughts came more slowly. They didn't disappear, they didn't fade away. They simply arrived with less insistence. One reminded one of another, which soon settled beside it without competing for space. There was no anxiety about organizing what would come next. Tomorrow could wait. The city was still there, intact. No damage, no loss, no real flaws. And yet something had changed. Perhaps it was just perception. Perhaps it was the contrast. Or perhaps it was the silent reminder that not everything needs to function at its best all the time to be functioning well. Some residents briefly considered what it would be like to wake up the next day. Would the lights come back on? Would routine resume its usual course? Would the streets once again be filled with lights, advertisements, and movement? The thought would arise, and then fade away. It didn't matter. That night, what was available was enough. In a house near the square, a person fell asleep with the window slightly open. The night air drifted in softly, carrying distant and undefined sounds. Nothing threatening, nothing specific. Just the presence of the city breathing alongside. There were no intense dreams, no confusing images. Sleep came easily, just like it used to. At some point during the early morning hours, a light came back on. Just one, then another, and another. On different streets, without any clear order. It wasn't a complete return. It wasn't an event. It was just gradual, and no one stood up to watch. The need to testify had passed. Whether the lights were fully restored before dawn or remained dimly lit until sunrise, no one could say for sure. Each person had a slightly different version of that night, and none of them seemed wrong. In the morning, the city would wake up as it always did. People would leave their homes. Doors would open. Conversations would take place. Someone might comment that the lights had gone out earlier than usual. Others might not even think to comment. Because certain experiences don't require explanations, they are simply asking for silence. The city left no messages. He offered no signals. He didn't promise a repeat performance. She simply showed that, for a few hours, it was possible to exist with less glitz and more presence. And, without even realizing it, each resident carried with them this discrete memory, stored somewhere quiet in their mind. A place that could be visited again, on future nights, when the world seemed too bright. The mystery remains unsolved. He simply settled down. Like the soft light before sleep, like the last conscious breath before falling asleep. Like a city that, for one night, decided to rest along with its inhabitants. As the hours passed, something curious happened inside the houses. It wasn't a visible event. There were no external signs. No change in the sky, the streets, or the few lights that remained on. The transformation took place in a quieter place. Memory. People began to remember, not something specific, not a remarkable event or a moment that demanded attention. They were small, almost forgotten memories that surfaced effortlessly, like dust illuminated by a soft beam of light. Someone recalled a similar night, many years before, when the power had gone out and everyone had gathered in the living room, talking quietly, waiting for time to pass. There was no intense nostalgia, just a quiet recognition. Another person remembered the sound of their own city in past decades, when the nights were naturally darker and the silence didn't feel strange. The thought came accompanied by a comfortable feeling, like an old object found at the bottom of a drawer. These memories didn't impose themselves, they offered themselves. And, curiously, no one tried to push them away. Without the constant glare of artificial lights, the mind seemed to have more space. Not to create, plan, or solve problems, but to rest on things that didn't demand action. In an old house, someone ran their fingers across the surface of a wooden table, feeling small marks left by time. There was no reason for that gesture. It simply happened. As if the body recognized the need for contact with something real, solid, present. The silence of the city remained a living silence. There were distant noises, an occasional creak, a nocturnal animal passing unnoticed. The almost imperceptible sound of the wind touching facades and roofs. All of this had always existed, but now it was heard. And, being heard, it became enough. Some people thought about calling someone, not to ask about the lights, not to seek explanations, just to hear a familiar voice. The thought arose, and past the feeling of connection was already there. Even without the phone, the city seemed to function as a large space of shared memory, even if no one was aware of it. Each resident, in their own home, was experiencing similar thoughts, as if they were all tuned to the same low.com frequency. There was no urgency to record that night. No one thought of taking photographs. No one wrote long messages. Perhaps because some experiences lose something when they are transformed into evidence. At one point, someone sat near a window and observed the street for a few minutes. They didn't expect to see anything specific. They just observed. The street was almost empty. A street lamp out. A long shadow. A still tree. Nothing happened. And yet the observation was complete. Memories kept coming, but now in an even lighter way. Some were so old that they didn't have clear images, only sensations. The smell of a place, the tone of a voice, the feeling of security that needed no explanation. The city, outside, remained discreet. It didn't demand attention. It didn't call, didn't pressure. It simply sustained that rare state in which time seems to slow down enough to be felt. At some point in the early morning, someone thought that perhaps it would be good if the lights didn't come back on so soon. Not as a permanent desire, just as a momentary realization. The idea didn't bring worry, it brought rest. Sometime in the early morning, the city stopped waiting. There wasn't an exact moment when it happened. No clear sign, no conscious decision, just the feeling, subtle and almost imperceptible, that the need for explanation had dissolved. The hours passed, but time seemed different. Inside the houses, the clocks continued to mark the minutes with precision. Even so, no one seemed to be guided by them. The body, more than the hands of the clock, took control of the rhythm. Some got up to drink water. Others settled more comfortably in their chairs or beds. Small adjustments, made without haste. The silence, which might have previously seemed strange, was now familiar. It wasn't absolute silence. There was always something happening in the background. A distant creak, a slight crack coming from the old wood of a house. The muffled sound of footsteps in a neighboring apartment soon interrupted. These noises did not break the silence. They were part of it. The city seemed to have found its own tone, a kind of low, constant frequency that didn't demand attention, but offered companionship. Being awake at that hour didn't seem inappropriate. Sleeping, either. The two coexisted without conflict. Some people fell asleep without realizing it. There was no clear moment of transition between wakefulness and sleep. No attempt to control thoughts. Rest came as a natural continuation of the stillness, as if the body had recognized that it was safe to switch off a little longer. Others stayed awake, but not restless. They sat near windows, observing the dark sky, where few stars managed to show themselves through light clouds. They weren't looking for signs. They weren't expecting answers. They simply observed, like someone accepting a simple gift. The absence of artificial lights was beginning to seem less like a flaw and more like a choice made by someone who knew the city well, as if that pause had been planned, not to solve something, but to allow something. In some homes, old lamps remained unlit, even though they still worked. Not for economic reasons, not out of fear, simply because the soft moonlight and the distant glow of a stranger's window were enough. The city, seen from above, would look different that night. Not completely dark, not completely illuminated. An unusual balance, where the eye would find no obvious focal points. Everything blended in soft, almost homogeneous tones, inviting contemplation rather than analysis. There were no attempts to contact the authorities, no formal complaints, no urgent questions, perhaps because, deep down, everyone felt that that night didn't call for intervention. It was like an unexpected visitor who arrives unannounced, sits quietly, and stays long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be bothersome. Silence was no longer something to be filled. It was becoming a habitable space. At one point, someone thought that perhaps the city was remembering what it used to be like, before the excessive light, before the constant noise, before the need to always be alert. Because, in that more restrained, darker, and slower version, the city was still recognizable. It was still home. And the city, for the first time in a long time, seemed comfortable with it. Just before dawn, something changed again. It wasn't the light that came back first, it was the sensation of movement. The city, which had remained in a suspended state for hours, began to show almost imperceptible signs of transition. Nothing abrupt, nothing rushed, just small hints that the night was moving towards another stage. The air felt different, fresher, lighter, as if it had been renewed during those quiet hours. In some homes, people who had been sleeping woke up slowly, without alarm clocks, without startle. They opened their eyes without urgency. They remained motionless for a few moments, as if they wanted to preserve something of the silence that still lingered. Others stayed awake, feeling the gentle weight of natural weariness, not the kind caused by restlessness, but the kind that comes after a long, quiet wake. Outside, a first sound stood out. A bird, then another one. They weren't loud or lively songs. They were spaced out, careful notes, as if even they respected the slow rhythm of the city. The sound spread without echo, finding still empty streets and sleeping facades. The lights remained off. But now that seemed less relevant. The light was beginning to emerge from another place. A faint band on the horizon, a different hue in the sky. Nothing that demanded immediate attention, just a gradual, almost intimate change. The city didn't wake up all at once. She was stretching. On a narrow street, someone opened a window just a few inches. The gesture was silent. The morning air entered without resistance, bringing with it a faint scent of damp earth and cool leaves. The window wasn't opened fully. It wasn't necessary. The outside world was already present enough. Some people briefly wondered if the lights would come back on before full daylight. The question arose, and then faded away. The answer, at that moment, didn't matter. There was a common feeling, difficult to define, but shared, as if everyone knew that the night was coming to an end exactly as it should. No significant events would occur now, no belated revelation, no final explanation, and that seemed appropriate. The city maintained its discreet posture. The streets were still calm. The streetlights remained off, but there was no longer any active mystery there, only a silent residue of what had been lived. Time resumed its usual course, but something about it had been softened. Some routines would soon begin. Coffee would be made. Doors would be opened. Footsteps would echo more frequently. Still, there was a certainty that this morning would not be like the others. Not because of something that had happened, but because of something that had been felt. The night had left a faint, almost invisible, yet ever-present mark. A memory without clear images. An experience without a closed narrative, and perhaps for that very reason, it is enduring. The sky was slowly lightening, without any hurry to announce the day. The city followed this movement with the same calm that had sustained the darkness. Nothing needed to be recovered. Nothing needed to be explained. The night was dissolving, not like a problem solved, but like a peaceful dream beginning to fade away, leaving only a feeling of rest. And the city, silent and awake, accepted it. As morning gradually arrived, the city began to reveal something that hadn't been visible before. Not in the streets, not in the buildings, but the way everything seemed settled. The first activities of the day came with unusual gentleness. Doors opened slowly. Curtains were drawn back just enough to let the light in. The sound of footsteps returned to the sidewalks, but without its usual urgency. The artificial lights remained off in many places, even where they could have already been turned on. Not because of forgetfulness, nor because of a malfunction, simply because no one felt an immediate need for them. The city was functioning, and it worked well. People noticed it, even if they didn't comment on it. There was a shared feeling that something had been rearranged overnight, not physically, but internally, as if the excess had been temporarily removed, allowing the essential to show itself. The sky was now clear enough to reveal details previously hidden, textures on the facades, small cracks in the asphalt, trees that seemed closer together. None of this was new. It was just being observed more closely. In some homes, the coffee was brewed in silence. The steam rose slowly, filling the air with a familiar and comforting aroma. No radios were immediately switched on. No need to fill the space with outside voices. The silence of the night was still there, diluted, but present. Memories of the darkness returned in fragments, not as a strange event, but as a necessary pause. Something that had happened at the right pace, without asking permission. No one talked about fear, because there was no fear. Nobody talked about failure, because nothing had broken. The only thing people were saying, when they were saying it, was that the city seemed calmer, closer, simpler. Some attributed it to rest, others to the weather. Others preferred not to explain, and this lack of explanation caused no discomfort. In a square, someone sat on a bench for a few minutes before going about their day. They watched the morning light filtering through the tree branches, creating irregular shadows on the ground. A small gesture, but one that wouldn't have happened on an ordinary morning. Night had left some space, and that space was now occupied by attention. The city didn't seem eager to fully resume its old rhythm, as if it had learned something, even if it didn't know exactly what. The lights began to return gradually in some neighborhoods. A lamppost here, another there. No announcement, no prominence. They blended into the day, not as protagonists, but as discreet support. And even when they returned, they couldn't erase the feeling that had been built up during the darkness. The city continued on, but it was going differently. Not transformed, not renewed, just adjusted, like an ancient instrument carefully tuned, without altering its essence. And perhaps that's what remained after that night. Not a mystery to be solved, not a story to be told in detail, but a quiet reminder that sometimes, when the light fades a little earlier than usual, something inside finds space to linger. Sometime later, it became difficult to say exactly when that night had completely ended. Not because the day hadn't arrived, it did. The sun completed its journey. Routines resumed. The lights returned to their usual state. The city moved forward. And yet, something from that night remained outside of time. Not as a recorded event, not as a topic of discussion, but like a silent, almost invisible layer superimposed on everyday life. People didn't wake up the next day with the feeling of having experienced something extraordinary. There was no enthusiasm. There was no expectation. Just a tranquility that was difficult to pinpoint, like a distant echo that cannot be identified, but can be felt. The city looked the same. The streets were in the same place. The buildings hadn't changed. The lampposts were back to their usual function, turning on and off at the usual times. Nothing suggested that anything different had happened, and yet anyone paying attention would notice subtle changes. The following nights seemed a little quieter. Even when the lights were on, they seemed less intrusive. The overall pace of the city, albeit subtly, had slowed down. It wasn't something measurable. It was something that felt deeply. Nobody marked that night on calendars. No news was written. No official explanation was offered. And perhaps that's why it has remained intact. Some experiences don't require understanding. They are simply asking for acceptance. At certain times, someone would vaguely remember the feeling of walking through dimly lit streets, of observing shadows without haste, of feeling that there was no urgency to get anywhere. The memory would come and go without insistence. There was no need to revisit it. The city, in turn, did not try to repeat what had happened. It did not deliberately turn off its lights. It did not seek to recreate the silence. It continued living, knowing, perhaps without knowing, that that pause had already served its purpose. Like the pause between two breaths. At night, when the lights came back on, some people would leave a light off for a few extra minutes. Not to save money, not out of old habit, just because they liked the feeling of transition. Others would open windows before turning anything on. They would observe the darkness. They would listen to the sounds. And only then would they turn back on the artificial light. Small gestures, almost imperceptible, but enough. The city did not become a permanent mystery. She only carried one. A mystery that didn't require a solution. A mystery that didn't bother anyone. A mystery that lay with those who remembered him. And, as time passed, the question of why the lights went out earlier ceased to arise. Not because it had been answered, but because it was no longer necessary. Some things don't happen to be understood. They happen to be felt. And that night, when the city grew darker than usual, something found space to rest. Something that needed no name, no form, no conclusion. The city remained illuminated, but never again completely. There would always be somewhere discreet, enough shadow to remind us that not every light needs to stay on all the time. And that was enough.